Hello, everyone, and welcome to Orthodoxy. My name is Andy Schmidt. I am your host. In this episode, I got to talk with the professor of politics from the University of Virginia, John M. Owen. John is a senior fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture and the Miller Center for Public Affairs. He is the author of Confronting Political Islam, 6 Lessons from the West's Past, The Clash of Ideas in World Politics, Transnational Networks, States and Regime Change, from 1510 to 2010, Liberal Peace, Liberal War, American Politics and International Security, and his new book, The Ecology of Nations, American Democracy in a Fragile World Order. Owens is published in the European Journal of International Affairs, International Security, New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, and many others. He received his Master's of Public Policy from Princeton University and his Ph.D. from Harvard University. He has held visiting positions at Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, Oxford, and Free University of Berlin, and the University of British Columbia. In our conversation, we talked about his book, The Ecology of Nations, and how different countries in the world interact with each other on the geopolitical landscape. We also discussed his article on First Things, on the 4 stages of liberalism. We talked about how younger generations are moving toward authoritarian regime and away from democracy. And finally, we discussed how one's theology must connect to their political philosophy. This was a wide-ranging conversation. It was about 2 hours long. I had a fantastic time. I think this is a very important discussion, and I was honored to have it. So I hope you enjoy. I am here with John Owen. I'm sure you've gotten this before, but not the Puritan theologian John Owen, the one from 400 years ago. This is a different John Owen.
Right.
But a fantastic name. Look, before we get into
no relation, as far as I know. I have visited his home village in Oxfordshire,
Really?
England, of all things, but no relation, as far as I know.
Wow. Okay. I was wondering, I was like, wow, how is it that I look up John Owen and I'm like, oh yeah, I got to put the specificities in here because of John Owen. Yeah. So, okay. Well, before we get into this podcast, tell everybody about who you are and what you do. And then we can move into it.
Yeah. So I teach political science. I'm a professor at the University of Virginia. I specialize in international relations. I have been at UVA since 1997 for quite a long time. So I teach courses, undergraduate and graduate level, on all kinds of things. There's a broad body of theory we teach in international relations. So that's my kind of main area. I also have written material about U.S. foreign policy, political Islam some years ago, in the years after 9/11. More recently, I've become very interested in China and Russia and the whole authoritarian challenge.
Sure.
And also what's wrong. There's some defective features of U.S. foreign policy I'm quite interested in as well. So, but in general, over the years, I've been really interested in democracy and foreign policy. You know, how do democracies actually different when it comes to foreign policy than authoritarian countries? We think we are. Is it true? And I think it is true, but maybe in some ways that we don't realize. And then what does that mean? What does that mean for how we should live as American citizens and really as Christians? So
Right. Well, and that's the perfect segue, because I think people who have been listening to my podcast for the last couple of months, I've made a shift from I used to do just theological content. We're just going to talk theology, but I recognize that people my age are having a really difficult time connecting theological principles to their responsibility in the political world that we live in. And so we've been kind of moving towards how do you live your Christianity out in a political world? How do you actually connect your theology to your political philosophy? And so I don't have the answer. I'm trying to figure this out. And to give people some context, I read you wrote an article on First Things, or kind of an essay on First Things. I read through it. I thought it was really interesting. And so I shot you an email and we got this set up. I had my last podcast with Jill Nelson. She's a reporter from World Magazine. Right. And we did talk about the wars in Ukraine Ukraine and in Israel, and just, her perspective is she's a reporter. She's, on the ground, kind of reporting the facts as they come. Whereas your perspective is a it's a political philosophy. You're looking at a much bigger picture and figuring out how things work together. And so we're going to talk about, how does our faith interact with the geopolitical landscape, which just seems like a massive conversation.
Yeah.
But you wrote this book, The Ecology of Nations, and I want to start by talking about this. What exactly is this book about? And give us some of the themes that you talk about through the book.
Yeah. So first of all, it's written for a secular audience. It's written for my guild, Yale University Press. So I think somebody could read this book without really getting a clue. I mean, I think people who know I'm a Christian can see it in there, but it's not. It wouldn't present itself obviously to somebody who's not or doesn't know that about me. So, okay, the book is starts with this premise that lots of people start with now. There's something wrong with American democracy. What is it? It's not. Things aren't going well. At the very least, we're really polarized. Things often seem on a knife's edge. We have 50-50 elections routinely, and the losing side always is challenging the legitimacy of the result. This goes back to 2000 with George W. Bush. Actually, it didn't start with Trump. So. So what's going on, and also polarization means, you can at Thanksgiving you can be with family members and not get along very well. You can because discussion turns to politics. So what's going on? And I'm old enough to remember, this has not been a completely united country ever. I mean, maybe in World War II during the big wars, people were more or less rowing in the same direction, but. Disagreement is a good thing on the whole. It keeps us honest. It's how we innovate. But this is something different. This is it looks like there are moments where it looks like the country may have trouble keeping together, right? So I start out with that. Lots of people are writing about this. I study international relations, so I noticed that we're not the only country, not the only democracy going through something like this. I've spent time over in Europe. I spent the first 5 months of this year in the UK. If you look at the continent of Europe, some of this is going on as well. This polarization, this left and right moving further and further apart, both seeing the other as the enemy. So the fact that this is happening in a number of mature, wealthy democracies at the same time tells us something. This is not just an American problem. There's something going on in the world. We could call it the international system. So what is that? And so I developed these ideas in the book about how we Americans in particular like to think. First of all, we don't think about the international environment very much because we're so big and powerful. It's just America. We do what we want, and this is our problem. And we created the problem. We can solve it, but I argue that the United States, as big and powerful as it is in an environment that is shaping it, that it's influencing it. America being so powerful, though, also shapes that environment. So it's a back and forth. We shape the environment shapes us. If you're a smaller democracy like, France or Italy, Poland, you do less shaping, you do more, you're shaped more than you do the shaping. But even so, all countries have some role here, right? So it's a back and forth. All right. So how does that help us understand what's going on? Well, the United States has been shaped, our politics, our society, our economics has been shaped by an international environment that we helped create over the last several decades, by which I mean, among other things, there are international rules and institutions that we set up after World War II that were designed really to safeguard our own democracy. Our European allies and Japan were in on it too. They all were, after the war, constitutional democracies. Some of them had just gone through a horrible bout with fascism. Many of them were threatened by communism back then. The Soviet Union was very powerful and alluring to a lot of people, especially factory workers and miners and so on, and some intellectuals. So all these politicians, including Harry Truman and his administration way back in the 40s, constructed these rules and institutions. They also built alliances with fellow democracies. NATO, which is still around, was a product of this era, started in 1949. We formed a similar alliance with Japan, a new democracy. This is also to kind of guard democracy mostly from communism at that point. Mm-hmm. And we also had a project of promoting democracy, especially in Europe. It later grew to include other parts of the world. So all of this is the United States trying to shape its environment, not out of altruism or because, we believe democracy is the best, and so we're just going to spread it in an evangelistic fashion. There was some of that, but mostly it was actually a self-protection. Like our democracy, America as a democracy will thrive more if there are more democracies out there in the world, right? Because they had learned a lesson from the 1930s and 40s. If fascism, Nazism, or communism are really on the increase out there in the world, it's bad for us. It makes it harder for us to be a thriving democracy. So let's turn that around. Right. So this is all old history. Some of these institutions are still in place even now. The United States, NATO is bigger than ever, right? And that's something we could talk about. Maybe it's too big. Some people think maybe it should stop growing. Mm-hmm. But between the 1940s and today, there have been some changes. And one of these, I argue in the book, is the kind of, I'll put it this way. In the 40s, the liberalism that shaped the United States, our institutions, our laws, really our people, our society, was a different kind of liberalism. It's often called welfare liberalism. It was designed to ensure full employment of the male head of household. Frankly, this is many decades ago, before really feminism took off, and it involved a lot of government intrusion in the economy to regulate that. So the New Deal was what we called it in the United States, but other democracies called it other things. They were all doing the same thing, and so the international rules set up way back then were designed to safeguard that kind of liberalism within countries. In the 70s and 80s, that welfare liberalism was rejected, kind of thrown out the window because it really wasn't working very well anymore. The country, and I'm old enough to remember this, the 70s, stagflation, very high inflation and unemployment, and government didn't seem to know what to do about it. So a different kind of liberalism began to take shape, both economically and culturally. And I call this in the book and in that First Things article, open liberalism. And it's involved a couple of things. In the economy, it involved pulling the government back a bit, deregulating the economy, cutting taxes, letting markets determine prices and employment rates and so on. And this was done in the name of creating wealth. It also involved breaking down more barriers to movements of capital, of money across countries. So in the 40s and 50s, if you're France, you can actually, and Americans are investing in your economy, you can keep the Coca-Cola company from closing a factory and pulling the money out. In the 70s, that ends. And so you see money moving around the world much faster. You see a lot more international trade. This creates wealth. It really works, but it also disrupts the economies of wealthy countries like our own. Because when you open the economy that much, you're going to lose jobs. You're going to lose manufacturing jobs if you're the United States. You'll gain some other jobs, and the overall wealth will increase. But so that's open liberalism's economic side. Open the economies, get government more out of the picture. Culturally, open liberalism also rejected the old welfare liberalism. It's much less about security of the family with the head of household, the breadwinner, being guaranteed employment, and a kind of a really what looks to us like a conformism of the 50s and early 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And it's much more about the individual self-creation as a kind of the good life. Like I can decide not just what I'll look like, but who I'm going to be. I can choose my own identity. I can even create it.
This is,
yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say the conversation around liberalism, whether it's classical liberalism or now like open liberalism, I wanted to I think this is all really helpful, and the history is super helpful. And I think it's important that we define the terms, because from what I understand, and I want you to tell me if I'm wrong here, the way that I understand liberalism is that it's connected to like its root is in the word liberty, or libertas, the Latin, in which there's in philosophy, there's positive liberty and negative liberty.
Yeah.
The positive liberty is essentially the freedom to pursue virtue, or the freedom to pursue something more of outside of yourself, to conform yourself to something. The freedom to, I mean, that was kind of the American Revolution in certain ways, was to break away from the tyranny of England and to pursue religious freedom in accordance with what they thought was virtuous, which would have been less government. I guess individual states had their own churches at certain points, but there was going to be more variety in which somebody could pursue a Protestant virtue. Whereas open liberalism, and maybe a negative view of liberalism, is more of a looking inward, or what Carl Trueman describes as expressive individualism in a lot of ways, where you're just expressing who you think that you are on the inside, kind of arbitrarily or on the basis of how you feel. And so that first definition, would you say that first positive definition is contingent or reliant upon something even deeper, a more foundational? Because it's a freedom to pursue virtue or something outside of yourself means that it can't be a foundation, a philosophical foundation for a person, because it requires you to pursue something even further deeper than itself. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah. The positive negative distinction comes out of this essay by Isaiah Berlin, who was an Oxford political philosopher. I think it's very useful.
Sure.
It's a good way to, you've characterized it really well. So negative is just the freedom from inhibition, or from barriers to being what I want to be.
Yeah.
What I choose to be. And positive liberty is freedom to follow the good. So, whatever. Yeah. Now, I don't know. This is an interesting thing you bring up, Andy. Open liberalism, I wouldn't say, is exactly the same thing as negative liberty. In fact, there are people who think the American founding originally was about negative liberty.
Yeah.
But you have to add another ingredient, which is, what Tocqueville calls civil society. Let's start with churches. The freedom to decide what church I'm going to affiliate with, which will then instruct me on what the good life is, right? Mm-hmm. And positive liberty is seen by these folks as something oppressive, because they associate it with the state telling you what virtue is and actually moving you in that direction, right? So I don't know if positive negative is exactly what I'm talking about in the book, but it's a good thing to think in mind. And to answer your question, yes, for a Christian, or for any person of an Orthodox religious, conviction, positive liberty is probably what, again, getting government out of the picture. Just do I, as an isolated individual, do I want the freedom to decide for myself? Actually, I want the freedom to affiliate with a group that will then provide a community and instruct me. And, we would say Christians disciple me. And so that is a version of positive liberty. Yeah.
Sure. So how did this transition take place from even you talk about kind of some of the more the conform, I guess this is the social norm to the 1940s and 50s, and the more, the husband brings home he's a breadwinner and the wife stays at home with the kids, and it's a different world than in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Things start to drastically shift and change. What happened there? How did that change happen? And I mean, I guess we're not even making a moral claim here. The shift just happened. So how did it happen?
Yeah, I think everybody agrees who knows the history. This happened. Why? It's a mystery. Ultimately, I can be a little describe it a little more precisely, but I can't really explain it. So in the economy, I don't know why
Mm-hmm.
welfare liberalism stopped working. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but it is clear it had stopped, and lots of people want to go back to it. And maybe there are elements, and I think there are elements of it we can retrieve and probably should try again.
Sure.
But I think going back fully is a mistake. We would come to grief. But it stopped working. And meanwhile, there were people, economists and lawyers and so writers who had this alternative idea of opening up the economy and deregulating and so on. It's actually started under Jimmy Carter, a Democrat. We associated with Ronald Reagan, and he certainly was about this. But so all I can say is if you look at economic history, for some reason, tools that work for decades then stop working. So welfare liberalism also replaced what we usually call classical liberalism, which was laissez-faire, a bit more like open liberalism in some ways, that the government safeguards the currency, enforces contracts. Otherwise, it doesn't do very much in the economy. That stopped working in the early 20th century. The Great Depression was the worst part. So these things just go through cycles, and it's kind of mysterious. As to culture, more mystery there. I will say so my parents, I'm older than maybe some of your listeners, but so say your grandparents, maybe if you can find their high school yearbooks and look in those, and it looks like, first of all, a lot of people who are older than high school look like they're in their 30s to me, but the guys all kind of look the same, and the girls pretty much look the same, and that's coming out of the Second World War. But it was a worldwide, if you look at Europe and the Soviet Union, actually, there was a lot of conformity, and this was people felt secure in this. For whatever reason, in democratic capitalist societies, this just didn't last. This didn't go well. Didn't last very long. So you have, even in the 50s, this kind of bohemian movement starting up of nonconformity.
Sure.
And in the 60s, it explodes, right, with the counterculture.
Yeah.
And I'm not quite old enough to have participated in that, but I kind of remember the brother of a friend of mine went to Woodstock in '69.
Oh, wow.
What was that? Yeah, what was that? But he had a poster in his room. So this was a huge cultural movement. It was like a supernova. I mean, it was. So for whatever reason, its time had come. Again, not judging good or bad. It's just, it was a phenomenon. And we're still living in the aftermath of that, right? That some of the changes that came to the surface are still, they kind of stayed. They stayed with us. The counterculture became institutionalized. So the writer David Brooks has this book, Bobos in Paradise. It's about this, that a Bobo is an abbreviation for bourgeois bohemian. And he said that what happened was the 60s values took over the institutions of higher education, of corporate America, Hollywood, So it's not really rebellion anymore. It's actually the establishment, this kind of.
I was going to say, that's like such a bizarre thing, because the whole thing starts about, we're going to push back against the norm. We're going to push back against the man. Nobody's going to tell us who to be. And then through that, they infiltrated the institutions, and then it infiltrated the culture and became the norm. And I felt like, I'm 24. I actually am 25 tomorrow. I'm 24 today. And 6 years ago, I graduated high school. And I remember thinking, and I'm sure it's gotten even more outrageous today, throughout high school and as I grew up, like the thing that all my peers were kind of competing for was who was going to push the bounds the furthest, whether that be with our teachers, our parents, or whatever, whether that be in sexuality, which is the big thing now with transgenderism and things like that. But it was like, I couldn't consciously like articulate it, but that was just the overall feeling, and this competition to see who was going to go the furthest, who was going to push the boundaries the furthest. And it feels like it's never. I'm wondering when that bubble is going to pop culturally. Like, when are we going to push the bounds too far? Feels like we have in certain ways, but it's just interesting.
Good. It's a good question, and I think the counterculture folks have not come to terms with the fact that they hold power now. Right? They still want to I say they, I don't mean to us versus them thing, but there's this thought you keep hearing, well, we're not really the powerful ones. We're still on the outs, and we're speaking on behalf of the powerless. But when you run most of the foundations, Silicon Valley, Wall Street corporations and banks, academia, you've got the power. And so pushing back, I don't know if this is where you're going with that, but pushing back actually can mean becoming more conservative.
Right.
Because the establishment is conservative in a maybe a trivial sense that it wants to conserve its power and stay where it is. So that's conservative, if you like, but not conservative substantively in the traditional sense. Things like the traditional family or and so on. Yeah.
And have you noticed so I think that culturally this plays out, and what I've seen, I guess, I don't know if you've noticed, like, kind of the red pill movement, where you've got guys like Andrew Tate, who is like insane. But a lot of young men are looking at him and his just outrageous he's pushing so far back against the more leftist, liberal, or progressive ideology. But his ideology, and this is the weird paradox or irony in the whole thing that I've been trying to figure out, is like both sides are claiming to be different. The progressives want to be progressive, and somebody like Andrew Tate and this red pill movement, they want to be conservative. But their conservative movement isn't actually conserving anything other than what their sort of hedonistic desires and Andrew Tate is like, he got famous by starting a porn site. I mean, that's what he did. So it's like, that's not conservative.
Yeah, not really. Conservative, I don't know. Yeah. The sense that, this kind of brutal man, what macho, like men rule and do what they want. Okay. Maybe that's really deep conservative, but it's not certainly not Christian the way Christians think about. Yeah.
Right. And so it just seems to be two different manifestations on the basis of temperament of a negative sense of liberalism or of expressive individualism, which I'm not exactly sure how to reconcile that, because as I guess for myself, as a Judeo-Christian conservative, who I think that the common good for people is to align their lives with the truth of Christ. And I'm not, a Christian nationalist, but I would have that conversation. But I think that aligning yourself with the truths of natural law and of Christ is the best for each individual. I find myself to be a homeless person in this political landscape in America, because it seems like the right and the left, or I'm going to call them the Republicans and the Democrats, are both just different degrees of liberal, and different degrees of liberals for different reasons. The Republicans seem to be more focused on maintaining that sort of 1950s type of lifestyle, whereas the progressives seem to be focused on maintaining and progressing a more expressive individualistic type of lifestyle. But it just works stuff on different degrees, and I don't exactly know where I belong in all of that.
I think that's fair. And I think so. As you know from my book and that First Things article, I think I take this critique, but I think it's a mistake to say, well, let's liberalism's the problem. Let's throw it out. Let's be post liberal. I sympathize with lots of the argument. Yeah. Particularly the critique. But where I have to part company is with the certainly anti-liberal, but post-liberal. I'm not quite sure what that means or what it's pointing to, but I think the United States is just constitutionally, and I mean that deeply, not just that we have a set of basic laws, but it's in our DNA to be liberal in a very broad sense. That's not going to change. And second, we know from history that, especially under modern conditions in the modern world, with all the pluralism, frankly, industry, rapid communication, all these things, and non-liberal regimes they're quite oppressive, and they would not take the Christian church where it wants to go. That's my view.
Right. And I think there's validity to that. I guess I have two questions that come out of that. One of them is a little bit complicated, and I'll see if I can articulate it correctly. But in Carl Truman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, he kind of goes through the history of how do we get to the place that we're at? He kind of like everybody's asking that same question.
Yeah.
But he discusses something that kind of blew my mind in this, the rise of the Democratic Republic, the rise of the United States produces this industrial revolution. And so he discusses in the beginning these two fundamental worldviews. One is mimetic and one is poietic. The mimetic one is I get my meaning from something outside of myself, that the world is structured and there's natural law and I have to abide by that natural law. And then the poietic worldview is the world is raw material in which I can create whatever I want out of it. Now, the mimetic worldview would have been just assumed naturally by most people for human history, just because we are at the whims of nature for all of human history, and through the Industrial Revolution, which was built out of a mimetic worldview, comes this poietic worldview and becomes more prominent because people think that they can take raw material and create whatever they want out of it. Of course, we're talking on laptops across the country right now because of that. Right. We can do whatever we want. And so
guilty as charged. Yeah, right.
Guilty as charged. And so I wonder, as you discuss this open liberalism and kind of getting back to what you say, like the founders kind of have a more broad sense of liberalism, do you think that the founders had a broad sense of liberalism, but with the presupposition of a mimetic worldview? And if that's the case, and if you don't, that's totally fine. If that's the case, though, how do you have a functioning, structured a functioning liberalism that allows a presupposition of a poietic worldview? Because that's where I seem to see some of the breakdown in, and I guess some of the pushback on liberalism as an entity is because of the cultural presupposition. So, I hope I articulated that.
No, I think a majority of the American founders held to some version of this mimetic view. They would say, you can read the Declaration of Independence, but you can go beyond that as well. I think it's sort of embedded in the Federalist Papers. Certainly, if you look at pre-revolutionary America, British North America, it's hard for me to think of counterexamples. I think they're all subscribing to some, it's basically a Protestant culture, but one that says there's a law out there that God put in place, and we need to conform our lives to it. The church needs to conform to it, and we want to conform society to it as best we can. So you had in different colonies, established churches, Virginia, where I live, Anglican, Massachusetts, Puritan, Congregational, right? Yeah. So that said, there were some founders who embraced something more like a poietic view. I think Thomas Jefferson came close. He's not an Orthodox Christian. Tom Paine, who was a British American who then moved to France. Yeah, I'd say he's one of those. Yeah. Over in France, this seems to be a more typical view of liberty and what it's for at the time in the 18th century. So, and this is one reason why the French Revolution, I think, went much further and became much more violent, right? I mean, they're different. We can argue about that point, but I think the French Enlightenment, so this is embedded in the so-called Enlightenment, capital E movement, of philosophy, art, culture, and so on. And it took different forms. So in Scotland, and took one form, in France, it took another. So all of that said, you can argue that there's a tendency within liberalism toward this kind of self-creation, and there's no law out there I need to conform to. Yeah. You can see hints of this. So Wilhelm von Humboldt, a German thinker, talked this way. In the 19th century, John Stuart Mill. So this is there. It just wasn't dominant, certainly in the United States and Britain, Anglophone countries for the longest time, really till the 60s. And I'll bring up that word bohemian again. You'd say, sure, there were artists and poets who lived this way, but they were called bohemian because they were different. And you actually had to have a lot of money to live that way. Really, the lifestyle wasn't available or appealing to most people. Instead, most people lived perfectly good lives and passed on to their children, fairly traditional life under a liberal regime. And the nice thing about a liberal regime then was one of the main features of it was it allowed you to affiliate with whatever groups, church or otherwise, or not church, you wanted to, but it allowed your community to thrive, pass on its norms and teachings to your children, grandchildren. And you coexisted with other churches that would disagree on some pretty important things.
Yeah.
But you weren't killing each other anymore over that because it was a live and let live. You might say it was relativistic on some points. Infant baptism, yes or no. Well, we're not going to have the state get into that, right? We're just going to let communities do their thing and try to make converts. As long as you're free to leave one community and join the other, we're fine. So that's the view, I think, of the founding. It's reflected. I raised Alexis de Tocqueville a minute ago, this French writer who came to America in the 1830s and was very impressed with this. He said, we don't have this in France. And I'm not sure we can get it, but it works pretty well. It's got problems, but this is a functioning democracy. If you allow these communities to do their thing, unmolested by the state, within limits, you can't have human sacrifice within your religion, but, within pretty broad limits, you can have a well-functioning democracy. So that's the classical liberal picture, I think, of society and how people and how it nurtures very indirectly people in communities that are seeking to, if they believe in the God of Christianity, to obey God and form a living community under his direction. But if they don't want to do that, they can form a different kind of community.
I wonder, I don't know the history well enough, but do you think that there was a particular tipping point? And by the way, I think it should be mentioned because I think it's easy to talk about that time period in America. People all talk about it as it's a Christian time, but there's still the evil of slavery happening, and there's evils happening in our time. I mean, there's abortion, and there are churches who are compliant with that, and I think that that's just as evil as any church or Christian in the 1800s that was okay with slavery. So I think any church, any point in church history, you're going to have some major blind sides that need to be addressed. Do you think that there was any sort of cultural tipping point that in some way, shape, or form in the early 1900s to the mid 1900s and then into the 60s and 70s, there was a tipping point in which the culture at one point was taking on more of a Christian perspective? This is the thing that I hear in conservative circles. I don't actually know if it's true or not, that people were generally more Christian, whether or not they're cultural Christians or actually church-going believers who had faith in Christ. That we can have those distinctions, but generally speaking, there was a cultural Christianity, and in the 60s, something tipped, that the institutions then lost that cultural Christianity and became I guess they just kind of pushed a lot of sexual identity type things. But is there any validity to that? I honestly don't know if that's the case or not.
I think so. So first of all, in slavery, I'm glad you raised that. So I don't mean to portray classical liberalism or any of these liberalisms as having gotten everything right. They're more, so they do a couple of things. They allow communities, classical liberalism, and my preferred option for the future, pluralistic liberalism, both allow these communities to flourish, but they're not perfect. And in allowing communities to flourish, you can also allow to flourish some horrible practices, slavery being the worst of the 19th century. But it's important to remember that slavery was abolished under classical liberalism. Now, it took a civil war that killed 600,000 Americans. That is not the way we want to solve problems, right? So there's fear that America might be headed toward another civil war. I don't think things are that bad, but even so, we don't want massive violence to solve the problem. So it's a messy picture. But in any case, so that society really up until the 60s certainly more culturally Christian. The United States went through the Great Awakening of the 18th century, the Second Great Awakening in the 19th century. And
Yeah.
some say there was a third Great Awakening after the Second World War
Hmm.
when Billy Graham, the evangelist, was
Yeah.
getting going, and evangelical America was founding institutions, seminaries, the magazine Christianity Today. Church attendance in the United States was maybe at an all-time high in the 1950s.
Yeah.
Right. This is also welfare liberalism. It was really a culture of conformity. I'm actually sitting in Canada. I'm in Vancouver right now.
Oh, wow.
Vancouver is a more secular society than the United States, but in the 50s, church attendance was even higher here than in the States.
Really?
So it's kind of swung. It was further to the right, if you will, and now it's further to the left.
Yeah.
So that, what do we make of that right now in the 21st century, that era? Well, it's tempting for people my age to be a bit nostalgic for it, but it had deep problems, right? Because it's a cultural Christianity. And I also grew up in the American South, which I think was kind of the, I don't know, the ground zero for all of this. Everybody went, and it's also where segregation was hanging on during this period.
Yeah,
So,
true.
right. So there was a cultural Christianity where the church tended to, baptize, as it were, whatever social practices were dominant, be it women never being able to wear pants or Jim Crow segregation. All these things were the way we lived our lives, and we mingled it with Christianity. And it was very unhealthy, very bad, a bad witness, and very unjust to particularly our black fellow citizens and fellow believers for the most part. So,
legalistic. I mean,
yeah,
incredibly legalistic. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. On the other hand, there were all these social props behind Christian morality. So if you, even if you weren't a fervent follower of Christ, you believe that it's not good to have sex before marriage.
Yeah.
Or
Right.
it's not good to commit adultery. And maybe it's a little bit vague why, but it's because your society, it's just how your society does things.
Yeah.
That's out the window, right? So I think the social props were a healthy thing, but they're gone. I don't think we're going to get them back anytime soon.
Yeah.
The good thing is, being a Christian is now almost a strange thing.
It is. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that requires the Christian believer to actually stand up and be counted, right? I'll use that word weird we're hearing a lot now. It's kind of weird.
Yeah.
So here in Vancouver, church attendance is around, I've read somewhere 2% on a Sunday.
Wow.
So my family and I go to a church on Sunday morning, and out here, as back in Virginia, we go to church there as well. Here, the traffic is very light on Sunday morning, and people see us, and I'm wearing a jacket in my car. They probably have no idea what we're doing.
Yeah.
Because
right.
who goes to
Right.
church?
Yeah.
And there's a loss there. There is a loss, right? But there's some gains there, right? You really have to mean it. You have to be
totally
really devoted to Christ to do this. And I've raised 3 kids, and they know this. They, in a way that I did not growing up in North Carolina in the 60s and 70s. It wasn't as evident to me that being a Christian really is a call to taking up your cross daily. It's a call to discipleship.
Yeah.
That's very clear now in Western society in a way it wasn't back when I was growing up.
This is an interesting point, because it's I think hits at kind of the central confusion that I've seen among young people as it relates to how to interact with politics as a Christian, because there's one aspect of Christianity in which Christ is clear. People aren't going to like you. The world's not going to like you. You're proclaiming me, and they don't like me. They're not going to like you. And so we have to understand, we're going to proclaim Christ in whatever age we are in. And some people aren't going to like us. Some people are, and we have to be okay with that. The question, I guess, that people are wondering, and that I'm wondering, is at what point is in what aspects can you proclaim Christ and advocate for Christ in the political realm? And I think that it probably comes up to just discernment and conviction at certain points. But if I think that living in accordance with the truth is for the betterment of all people, I guess my understanding is, well, why wouldn't I advocate for that politically? And then people will say, well, you're getting into like Christian nationalism, you're enforcing the Christian worldview on other people. Oh, then I would have to be like, yeah, but everybody enforces their worldview on everybody all the time. You know, that like in a lot of ways, you know, they're enforcing their worldview on me. And so it's just the natural dialogue of human beings.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts on that specifically?
I do. Yeah. It is. I have noticed a shift with a lot of Christians in saying, well, nobody really believes in traditional marriage, one man, one woman.
Right.
So when we advocate for policies that favor that or inhibit alternative ways of organizing a family, we're imposing our values on other people.
Right.
And similarly with abortion, that if people just don't believe that an unborn baby is actually a person, who are we to say, et cetera, et cetera. You can raise lots of issues. So I get that argument, but I think you hit on it a minute ago when you said if we really do believe that it's better to live, in this way, which God prescribes rather than another, and we believe and if we love our neighbor, then we should want what's best for them, and we should advocate for policies that are best for everybody, and not fall into this trap of saying we are just kind of. Not only we perceived as weird, we really are weird. And we have for whatever reason, we have this strange set of beliefs, but it's not our job to impose those on other people. How do we maintain that, though, this idea that, no, it's good for everybody? Well, you mentioned this mimetic point that Carl Trueman makes a lot of. It's linked to natural law.
Yeah.
And there are Catholic versions and Protestant versions of natural law, but let's set that aside.
Yeah.
If there is such a thing as natural law, then we ought to be able to argue in ways that secular Americans can at least understand for these things that we think are good for everybody. In other words, this has to do with how we make the arguments. And thus saith the Lord just is not that was a winning argument in 1850 in Alabama or even New York, actually.
Yeah.
It is a loser now.
Yes. Right.
In fact, alienates people. But if you can say, well, let's look at the data. Let's look at what studies are showing. So I have a colleague at University of Virginia, Brad Wilcox, who's a sociologist of the family. He's a very data-driven social scientist. He has a new book called Get Married. I commend to you if you haven't seen this. And he's done a bunch of colleagues, not just Brad, but a lot of work on how the data show that, divorce, for example, divorce isn't great for kids.
Yeah.
Make of that what you will, but it's not simply an ideology or a bunch of fundamentalists who say divorce is bad. It's not some musty old text that a few people believe. It's in the data. Right. So that's a kind of argument that I think we can, in good conscience, and really ought to make, recognizing that this is a pluralistic society, probably will be for at least till I'm gone from the scene and well after that. Yeah. So we can't presume the same kind of public ethos that our ancestors could. And we certainly can't make the sorts of arguments that they made. They will not work.
Yeah, I'm reading a book called Social Conservatism for the Common Good. It's like a Protestant, a bunch of essays by different Protestants on Robert P. George and his political philosophy. And I didn't know anything about him, and I'm not all the way through the book, but I thought that there was a chapter, actually by Carl Trueman again, on reason and natural law. And Robert P. George's argument, a political philosophy argument, is kind of based in natural law rather than natural law is then based in Christ, in God, like God creates that. But he doesn't and it doesn't seem like he builds his arguments out of God created the natural law, therefore we need to impose natural law on all people. He just uses that natural law argument, probably in his head, knowing, of course, this is honoring to God because God created what is natural. And I'm persuaded by that in a lot of ways. I think that that's probably a better way in which a Christian can engage with the political conversation and political argumentation with the secular world, to say, well, let's just look at the data. Let's just look at the facts. Let's look at what's naturally true and try to build policy out of what the data says. That I think, like you're saying, if we look at the data, honestly, it's probably going to be in alignment with just what's real and true according to Scripture a lot of times, because
I think so. And I think it's important, getting back to liberalism and how we don't want to, I think it's a mistake to throw it out.
Sure.
We want to contest elections and work through the processes, the mechanisms, the laws, the Constitution that this country has, and not cheat and try to take over. and there is, you can impose values under an authoritarian regime. This is what Russia and China do. That's just not. I'm glad to say it's not the American way, and it's not the way of constitutional democracy. So what we have to do is make our arguments in the public square,
right?
And with confidence. There's another book that I think is terrific, John Inazu's Confident Pluralism.
Okay.
That we live in a pluralistic society. God knows this. He, in fact, for whatever mysterious reason, this is what he wants for us.
Sure.
But we can be confident that we know some things. We know things. We know how he meant for society to operate, and we can argue confidently in a democratic society, and we need to. And I hope Christians continue to run for office with this in mind. Not that we're going to take over and shut down democracy and impose laws, but we're just going to contest power and make reasonable arguments, precisely because we're confident, right? If we were insecure, then there might be a case for going authoritarian. Sounds funny, but we're not. We're quite confident,
right? And that's been my frustration with a lot of the way in which the right-wing media has moved towards sympathy towards Russia and authoritarian regimes, and that and I get it. Like, I get it as a Christian conservative guy who grew up in one of the most liberal cities in the country. Like, Madison, Wisconsin is not friendly towards people like me. Sure. And I had a very difficult time in high school. I had a very difficult time just because if you disagreed with the status quo, if you disagree with the liberal doctrine, or I guess not the liberal doctrine, obviously the progressive doctrine, I mean, you're the enemy. And I would be like, I have a big mouth, and I would say that I disagree. And I understand the compulsion towards feeling the need to shut that down authoritatively. But one of the fundamental Christian principles is that Christ himself imposes the truth on us. The Calvinistic perspective, that he imposes the truth on us and then we change from the inside out. That Christ is the one who can impose the truth. No sort of regime is going to impose that truth upon us. And the governmental regime can't change people's heart. Like, if you want people's hearts and minds to change, you have to, I guess, do that interpersonally, the way that Christ did with the disciples. He talked to people individually. He didn't overturn the Roman government and say, we're going to implement now the Christian authoritarian regime here in Rome. He did it on an interpersonal level. And so I think that sort of sympathy for Putin and Russia is, from people who claim to be Christians, is a misplaced and I guess a misunderstanding of some fundamental Christian ethics and doctrines. It's confusing.
I completely agree. Putin has successfully co-opted, you could say, Christian social conservatism in a lot of places. He has built very close ties with the Russian Orthodox Church, which has led to a schism in that church, both within Russia and internationally. I think it's pretty awful. The Russian Church has always been more intimate with the state than Western, certainly Protestant, but even Catholic Christianity has been with countries in the West. Nonetheless, this is something beyond what we've seen in a long time
Yeah.
in Russia. I think it's quite oppressive. There are Christians in Ukraine who would say what I just said, or what you just said, but put it more strongly,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
And not just evangelical, Baptist, but Orthodox in Ukraine
Yeah.
really have suffered deeply from this, to say the least. So,
Hmm.
yeah, I think just to bring it back around, I
Hmm.
don't think that liberal democracy, constitutional democracy, is the best of all possible regimes we can think of, right?
Okay.
I'll even go further and say Christians ultimately are monarchists
Hmm.
or even absolute monarchists, but the monarch is
God.
God.
Yeah. Right.
But we don't, and in the eschaton, we will live directly under his rule directly.
Mm.
Now we live, his rule is mediated through these earthly institutions and
Right.
groups, nation states that he, again, providentially has set up for
Hmm.
reasons of his own.
Mm.
And so we cannot live under that ideal regime.
Mm.
We live under imperfect, various forms of imperfect.
Mm.
And I think under modern conditions, history shows that constitutional democracy that recognizes the equality of all citizens is the best available
Hmm.
regime.
Hmm.
History just, what is it? Churchill said, democracy's the worst form of government except all
All
the
of
other forms that have been
Yeah.
tried.
That's
Okay, yeah, that sums it up with
yeah.
typical Churchillian wit.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's how I view it. Let's not think
Mm.
that this is, and I think some Americans and other liberal Democrats can get confused on that point and say this really is the best
Mhm.
best it could ever be. I think it's certainly the best under modern conditions, but
Yeah.
we especially Christians can't lose sight of the fact this is imperfect, and so we have to always be ready to be disappointed
Mhm.
by our
Mhm.
politicians, by our parties, and even by our system. It's not the eschaton,
Mhm.
right? That has to await Christ's return by
Yeah.
definition. So,
And to your point, I mean, a quick overview of the Old Testament would show that when the Israelites asked for a king, it didn't go well. It was just a regression. It was like
right.
the first one, Saul, was already not great, and then you get David, who was good, and then not so great, and then Solomon gets worse. It's just worse and worse and worse. It's and
Yeah.
God was like, "Why can't I rule you?" And they're like, "No, we want to be like the other nations. We want a
Well, yeah,
king."
exactly. We want to
Yeah.
be like the other nations, right?
Yeah. And so I actually was texting some friends the other day, actually yesterday, about Ukraine and I guess the conversation about why are we giving all this money to Ukraine and what are we doing in Israel? And I think a lot of my friends are more sympathetic to the isolationist perspective there as well. Let's just pull out of all these situations. And your book, The Ecology of Nations, I think is so helpful for me as I was reading through it, and you were describing, using a biological term, ecology, and you're describing this in biological terms as the way in which organisms interact with each other. It was like super helpful to putting together the massive international foreign affair conversation. How do we even approach a conversation like that? Because there's so many moving parts. So can you break that concept of ecology down for us? I think it's genius. It was really helpful to think through it.
Well, good. Yeah, I'm glad it's helpful. It's a analogy or a metaphor
Yeah.
for the situation countries find themselves in.
Yeah.
No country exists by itself. It's in an environment that it consists of other countries and rules and norms and ideas and all sorts of. It's a complex environment.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the argument I make in the book is that environment is not neutral with respect to democracy or
Mm-hmm.
authoritarianism. We
Yeah.
might wish it could be. And maybe under very special conditions, it could be neutral, but very hard to sustain those conditions. So it's going to be biased
Mm-hmm.
either toward democracy, free markets, or toward authoritarianism or some other system, right? So if you go way back in history, Europe, it was very hard not to be a monarchy in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Switzerland, Venice were republics, but they were small and weak and vulnerable for much of their history. Monarchy really was predominant.
Yeah.
And that's because the environment selected for it. And here I bring in this evolutionary language of selection. Again, it's all just metaphorical, but by selection, I mean it makes it so an environment that is biased in favor of democracy actually handicaps authoritarian countries. And their governments sense this. So let me give you a really concrete example that I discussed in the book. China right now. So China, calls itself a democracy, but it's not a multi-party democracy, right? I don't have to argue the point. The Chinese Communist Party is not a party in the way we mean it. It is actually, it runs the state, and it's determined to continue doing so.
Yeah.
China's leaders, I think, most of them sincerely believe that for China to be a unified, strong country, it has to be run by the Communist Party. I think they're wrong, but what I think doesn't matter. I think I've read a lot of these guys. They really believe making China great means Communist Party monopolizes power. Okay. They also are quite aware that China has grown extremely rich over the last 30, 40 years by no longer being aloof from the capitalist world the way they were under Chairman Mao Zedong back when I was a little kid. And instead participating, trading with the West, trading with the United States, allowing other countries to invest in their economy, student exchanges, business, all kinds of things. China is I've been to China 3 times. It's remarkably open. Now, it started to close up a little bit since Xi Jinping took over a few years ago, but so China has, if you will, entered the international environment, started this in the 80s, that the United States and its fellow democracies set up. And it's done really well. It's the number 2 economy in the world. It's on its way to being a superpower. If you're Chinese, what's not to like? Well, there's a lot not to like because the international environment also has some elements that we set up that they don't like. The most obvious is the human rights rules and procedures of the international system. Put in there by the Western democracies. We have a bias in favor of individual rights. It's just what we do. Yeah. So the Chinese know that this is biased against them. And the bias is not just that it hurts their feelings. It has actually cost them real money in the past. So way back in 1989, the Berlin Wall was about to fall. It was quite a year. Communism fell in Eastern Europe. Communism almost fell in China. It came pretty close. There were millions of students in the squares of various Chinese cities, especially Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And the Chinese party leadership decided, what are we going to do? This doesn't look good. They sent in the tanks and killed hundreds, possibly thousands. We don't have good numbers on this, but squelched it. It was over. And after that Tiananmen Square massacre, the United States, Europe, and Japan imposed pretty stringent economic sanctions on China. Stopped trading with China for the most part. It set China back. China's growth stalled for several years. It knocked them off the path of growth that they had been on. They were quite upset, to say the least, and they were trying to figure out why do the Americans care? It's not their country. Why don't they just let us do what we have to do? And they realized, they have this view of human rights for whatever reason, and it's really biased against China. And so what we need to do is change the way the world even thinks and talks about human rights. Let's get the world away from individual rights to protest and let's talk about group rights and national rights, the right to live in a sovereign country, the right to economic development, which is what we in China think is most important. And if we can do that, we can shift the international environment to favor us and stop, because it doesn't favor us right now, right? And I could talk about other, the internet, cyber. The Chinese party doesn't like internet openness. They censor their internet. Yeah, right. The Great Firewall. If you visit China, you'll face this, up close and personal.
Their TikTok is
Yeah.
like totally different than the United States TikTok
Yeah.
for
That's
the
right.
kids. It's like it shuts off at like 7 p.m. or something, but then it's all like math TikToks and like
Yeah.
educational, and here it's like
Right.
all sexualized
Yeah.
weird stuff, and you're like, well, so can I ask a real
Yeah.
quick question? Would you consider China to be, I assume probably yes, they're just a highly conformist society, or how would you
They
define?
have been. They have been. I think younger Chinese are much more like what you see in the West or
Okay.
Japan.
Okay.
And so there's a generational shift because of the openness of China. So China is a complicated place, right? It is
Yeah.
not a simple. It's huge, 1.2 billion people,
Yeah.
generational effects. China might have peaked in terms of its economic growth because its
Really?
population, the one-child policy is now means
Yeah.
there's a lot of old people and fewer young people, and a lot of young people just don't like the old Confucian conformist society, and
Mhm.
they don't have a lot of time for communism. But yeah, but the Chinese want to change international norms about the internet away from openness, the kind of Silicon Valley, everybody gets to communicate with everybody all the time, which I say is rightly is biased against them, and they want national censorship. They would call it internet sovereignty to become the international rule because that favors them.
Yeah.
So these changes in rules aren't just about what kind of TikTok are we going to have, though that's
Right.
important. It's really about which country's system has the advantage internationally in international competition.
Right.
And so the Western side knows this as well. So governments don't use my evolutionary ecological jargon.
Hmm.
They use different words, different jargon,
Yeah.
but the idea is the same. So if you look at both the Obama and the Trump administrations, they were very aware of this, that certain rules favor China and certain types of rules favor U.S. and the Western countries, and so we need to defend the Western. And sorry, the Biden administration too. This is a bipartisan issue.
Yeah.
I think everybody kind of senses this is going on, and so we can't simply. So one problem I have with isolationism is it ignores this ecological feature of world
Totally.
politics. The United States can pretend it's not there,
Yeah,
but
but
we're
it's a
going to
delusion.
suffer from that. And the last time we tried that, it was really the 1930s when we said we're going to have nothing to do. Yeah, fascism, communism, these are scary things, but that's okay. They're far away. We're in the Western Hemisphere, not our problem. We're going to worry about our own self in our backyard. Latin America maybe, but beyond that, not our problem. And guess what? Imperial Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and 2 days later, Nazi Germany declares war on the United States, and we're in. And then after the war, Soviet Union's very powerful. It develops the atomic bomb in 1949, and we're still in, right? So the idea of keeping aloof and just they'll leave us alone if we leave them alone, it just hasn't worked out historically. We're too big for them to ignore. We matter too much. In 1820, the British messed with us back then, but nobody else really did because we were small and not that consequential. But we are now, and we're permanently consequential. So we have to really attend to the international environment and whether it favors us and our system or if it favors authoritarianism instead.
It's okay. So you said that this is kind of in agreement on both the right and the left in the United States right now, and it's pushback against the Chinese movement towards international, let's just say, influence. And I think you're right. The interesting thing that I'm seeing among younger people is that there's more favorability towards the Chinese in a lot of ways. So, okay, like my friend that I grew up with, his name is Eddie Smith. He started a media company, and he went to Loras College. He's a public figure. He started a media company called Midwestern Marks in Dubuque, Iowa, and it's like gigantic now. And they just a couple of weeks ago started the American Communist Party, and it is. I obviously think it's a terrible idea. I think it's destructive, but it's gaining incredible momentum. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of followers across different platforms among young people who are incredibly sympathetic towards Chinese communism and toward Russia and Putin. And I'm actually working on doing a podcast with him to kind of go back and forth on this. And of course, like a good friend that I grew up with, he's a cool guy, but it's like, what do you think that I don't know if there's an answer to this that we know of yet, because it's true. It's like Trump and Biden had similar rhetoric toward China.
For China, yeah.
And some people think that Trump's rhetoric was stronger or Biden's was weaker, or that the Democrats sometimes will talk big but won't actually in policy do things about it. It doesn't matter. The rhetoric's the same. The rhetoric's there. They're talking against it. Do you have any idea or are even aware of why the younger generation seems sympathetic towards these communist regimes movement outwards? There's even in Russia, people are even all across the board are so skeptical of Ukraine and saying, well, if NATO continues to move east, why wouldn't Russia be angry? And we need to so what's going on there?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Russia and China probably goes without saying, have different regimes. Russia is not communist. Putin is an anti-communist of a sort. He's nostalgic for the Soviet Union in the sense that it was a superpower.
Yeah.
But I think it's fair and he was a KGB official under the communist regime, but I really don't think he's a communist. There's a communist party in Russia. He keeps them out of power. He keeps them weak. And I think that's important. China is communist in the sense that it's ruled by a communist party, but it has a lot of on some measures, at least 40% of its economy is market. And the state owns maybe 40%. So 60% is market, about 40% is state owned. So it's not communist in the old fashioned sense, but it is what we call Leninist, where the party monopolizes power and will not allow other parties to form, much less compete for power.
Okay.
So, We could go on. I have a feeling with an anti-communist love fest for a while. What's wrong with communism?
Right.
I think we agree on that. But it's interesting. I had not heard of Midwestern Marx, and I didn't know. I knew about sympathy toward Russia and Putin, and particularly and lack of sympathy for Ukraine. I had not known that there was really a movement that admires China and its regime. So that's good for me to know. I'd have to read a lot of the material to give a good answer, but I'll speculate and say it's significant. I think that people, some younger Americans, and I imagine this is happening across the Western world. Some of them are gravitating toward Russia, some toward China. They're both abandoning the idea of, Western constitutional democracy. Mm-hmm. So I read this as more negative, a reason, a push than a pull. The push is very powerful, and I understand it. People, younger Americans are justified in asking, remind me what's so good about our system.
Right.
I don't have a lot of economic opportunity. I see a lot of decadence. I can't, liberalism seems to mean actually adopting the correct opinions that I don't agree with. I can't even speak my mind. What's so great about this system? Right. So I understand the repulsion so what do you do with that? Well, you want to find alternative models that look maybe better, and they're out there. Some of them. So some people might say Russia looks better, or there's a lot of admiration for what Viktor Orban is doing in Hungary, which, or Poland under the previous government. China is another model. China, you hand it to the Chinese Communist Party. It has engineered over the last 4 decades, a remarkable period of economic growth and mostly stability. And, really like nothing the world has ever seen. The number of people that China has lifted out of poverty is remarkable. When I was a little kid, Americans couldn't go to China Richard Nixon went in the early 70s, and that was this kind of revelation. But it was a very poor country, mostly peasants. And
Mm.
now visit, especially Shanghai or Guangzhou,
Yeah.
Beijing, these cities. Shanghai is this financial district called Pudong that looks like Manhattan,
Mm.
except everything was built up since the 90s.
Mm. Wow.
It's amazing. So we're not going to deny the achievements, but
Right.
the price you pay living under a regime like that, I hope young Americans pay attention to. I'll give you one little story. All right. First time I was in China, I visited Beijing and Shanghai. And I was in Shanghai, and I contacted a journalist, not a close friend, but a guy I knew. He's still around, but he's a Christian, and he lived in Shanghai with his wife. He's from the West. And we had tea at the top of this beautiful building in Shanghai on the Bund, right on the river. And he said, "John, it's funny you would be here and contact me. We're about to leave China." My wife and I said, "Really? Why is that?" "Yeah, I've accepted a job with another publication in the West." "Well," he said, my wife and I host a Bible study here in Shanghai. We go to a church. And it's small. It's in our apartment once a week. We love the people. We got a knock on the door a few weeks ago, kind of late at night, maybe 11, and it was a couple of policemen. They were very polite, but they said, "Sir, we notice your Bible study has many people coming now, more than 20 a week. We think it would be a good idea if you split into 2 Bible studies, maybe 10 each. Have a good evening." And she said, "Okay, first of all, somebody's watching them. Maybe somebody in their Bible study is a commissar, a spy. But second, this is not just rape. This is the police. This is kind of a threat. Maybe it's time we got out of here, right?" And so I've told other people about this, both Chinese and non-Chinese. Yeah, this is how the party does things. It's okay. You can be a Christian. You can go to church, but we're going to contain. We don't want a concentration of people that aren't under the party's control to get too big. Right. 20 is too many people, even for a Bible study, right? So this was about 12 years ago, 13 years ago. It's only gotten more this way. So I hope young Americans take this to heart. See, this is the price you pay.
Right.
And it's not just about Christians, Orthodox Christians. I think most Americans say, there's something wrong with this. I don't want to live under that regime. I don't care what economic growth or how smart the bureaucracy is or how that this isn't a polarized society. I don't want this, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, no, I can see that. Actually, my wife went on a missions trip to China like 5 years ago before we met. And she was very much, she kind of says that as she talked to students on campus, a lot of their belief systems were just kind of surrounding what the Communist Party believed. They had never really asked questions of origin, like where did we come from and things like that. They had never kind of gone outside of the structures that have been set up. And so, she kind of says a lot of similar things just about there's a eerie kind of security or I guess vigilance that you need to have as a person going to, for her, she was going on campus and spreading the gospel, and they knew that people were watching them. And there was all this strategy of, okay, well, if they come and talk to you, just kind of get off of campus, things like that. But it's like, it is kind of an eerie, weird thing that we don't have to deal with this in the West. Now, I did interview a guy who wrote a book, and it was a Christian book, but I think it's in some ways related to what we're talking about right now, called "Why Do Protestants Convert?" And it's about why a lot of young Gen Zers and millennials are converting to Catholicism from Protestantism. And it's this weird thing that's happening because 20 years ago, it was like the opposite. It was like Anglican high church, Catholic high church was dropping in young people, young attendance, and now it's going up. And so I just converted from non-denominationalism to Anglicanism because of I was convinced through J.I. Packer, but that's a different story. But when
we're in Vancouver, we go to his old church.
No way.
St. John's Anglican. Yeah.
Wow.
He
Okay.
used to
He's
sit
like a
down the pew for me. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well,
Yeah.
dude, that's amazing. Like he's like a hero of mine, and I wish
Sorry to flex in the middle of this, but yeah, it's true. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's so cool. But this book talks about why these young people are moving in that direction, and I think one of the things that I picked up on that I've noticed is that with the breakdown of of fundamental institutions in the culture, like the family, that's the biggest thing. Mom and dad, having a mom and a dad in the home is incredibly rare. Actually, most of my friends I grew up with had divorced families, divorced parents, had multiple situations, had all these random siblings coming in and out of their life, and different their parents dating different people, and it was very dysfunctional in that way. That's the norm across Gen Zers. It's like 55% of marriages end in divorce, and I get that's kind of contingent on how many divorces you've had. The rate goes up, but on average, 55%. I think that the movement towards high church Catholicism and Anglicanism in some ways has to do with a deep desire for structure from individuals. I want these structures back, and I want somebody to tell me. I don't want people to say, hey, you can just figure out how to live on your own. Like we've tried that and we're failing at it. My generation is. We want somebody to say, here's how you should live. And I think that that's inherent into what it means to be a human being. But I also think that can become like the Israelites in the Old Testament, in which they say, I want the king to just tell me what to do, and I don't want to think for myself, which flies in the face of this classic liberalism in which there's an individual freedom, there's an individual responsibility to one. Yeah, you have to take the truths of your ancestors, but you have to do something on your own. And I wonder if that is in relationship to why young people are sympathetic towards these more authoritarian regimes, because they're seeing the breakdown at the local level. They are abstracting out to this governmental level and saying, well, maybe the government can make up for the thing that I'm missing here at home. And so I'm going to be an advocate for that because I can't seem to fix what's happening right here in my immediate vicinity. Do you see any legitimacy to that?
I do.
Yeah.
I think that's really astute, Andy. Yeah. And I would say just normatively, let's strengthen the churches.
Yeah.
So that drift or this, I don't know, what are there rules? I don't know. I have to make this
Yeah.
up as I go along. That's life under open liberalism, I
Sure.
think. So what do we do about it? Because it's not,
That's the
most
question.
people, it's just not a good life.
Right.
The government, in our fallen world, empowering the state to structure our lives heavily is not going to work well.
Yeah.
Certainly from a Christian perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But churches, almost all institutions in our society are weaker than they used to be.
Yeah.
Right, from bowling leagues,
Yeah.
right,
Right.
labor unions, certainly churches. And part of this is people, if you look at opinion polls, people don't have a lot of confidence in any institution, maybe the military, but universities, where, my line of work, no way.
Right. Right.
Congress, churches, partly because of clerical scandals, right? Catholic and
Right.
Protestant alike.
It's unbelievable. It's like every other week.
So we understand the disillusionment.
Mm-hmm.
But what we need to work for, those of us in the church, is to strengthen the churches and get over this anti-institutionalism. I mean, I understand it up to a point. So there's another writer I really like, Yuval Levin, who's written on this sort of thing. He's Jewish guy, but very sympathetic to across religions to the collapse or weakening of institutions, both within Judaism and Christianity and other religions as well. And he says one thing our society needs to do is strengthen institutions, which involves a lot of things. One thing it involves is individuals saying, I belong to this institution. That's a role I'm going to play. Yeah. I'm going to sacrifice. Like it's okay to be conformist in the sense that I go to this church.
Yeah.
I adhere to its teachings. I'm going to hang out with its people. I'm going to host a group in my home or teach Sunday school, even though it means I can't do some other things, or it might be kind of embarrassing if people find it. I don't, it's just who I am. I'm committing to this thing. And this is how people used to live. It used to be
Yeah.
normal to
Right.
do this. So yes, you're. In other words, I agree with you completely that people are casting around, adrift people are casting, and it's not just young people. I mean, frankly,
Yeah.
the institutional weakening has affected my generation too,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Um, and some are going to look to the state, to politics, to government, to politicians, to parties to help out. And I
Hmm.
think that's a bad path.
Hmm.
If you adhere to a religion, you should look at your religious institutions and think about strengthening them, and that requires real commitment. It can be a pain in the neck.
Hmm.
It means you're hanging out with people who might annoy you, right?
Yeah.
It
Right.
means compromising, and you might annoy them, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But
Right.
it's okay because this is how it ought to be. This is how God set up the world so that we thrive in community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It seems like beneath the breakdown of the institutions is honestly, like you're saying, a breakdown in virtue, individual personal virtue, because
Yeah,
institutions they're made up of human beings. And if human beings don't have virtue, then the institution is going to fall apart. And I
yeah,
think that is a highly individualistic attitude. The person that you can enforce virtue on is yourself, and you can try to enforce, and I don't necessarily think that this is going to, like Jonathan Edwards talks about, like the three views of virtue or the two views of virtue. I might botch this, but I think true virtue is doing what is right for the sake of Christ, doing it for the glory of Christ. And
mhm,
then I think he says real virtue is doing good, but not for the right reasons. So, the Pharisees doing good, like not
yeah,
doing good for Christ, but just doing good because maybe you're doing it because you want other people to just think you're a good person. You're
right.
still
Conformity
engaged.
or something like that. Yeah,
Exactly. The tension, the Christian tension is enforcing true virtue upon yourself. And I'm using that strong language, but adhering to true virtue, but then somehow trying to advocate for, at the very least, real virtue in your immediate surrounding. And I just remember thinking as I was growing up in this confusing world, I was like, why? I always thought it was so cringy. It's just so dumb of me. I thought it was so cringy that people got so involved in their local institutions. It's like, why do people care about their churches or their school board? Who cares? Nobody. What the only thing that matters is the top guy, the president. That's all that matters. The person that's in charge of the biggest organization, who has the most power. That's what matters more than anything. And as I've grown older, and obviously I have two kids now, I'm realizing the reason why I should focus on the institutions that are closely related to me is because those are the things that are going to shape the minds of my own children. They're going to shape my own. They're shaping. The further out you get, the less influence something will have on you, right? Like the federal government, I was supposed to not have so much influence on people, and the local government was supposed to be empowered through that.
that's right.
And so
That's right.
I realized that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in fairness, you're right. We've a lot of people feel that way. You got to
Yeah.
go to the top to make any change because our government has become more centralized.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right, it has taken away some of the prerogatives, and some of that's good. Like this southern states can't practice slavery anymore. That just
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, there are limits to how much.
Yes.
But you could argue some things have gone too far, and it's kind of atrophied local government at
Mm.
least, and maybe state government to some extent.
Mhm.
So that people say, "What's the point?
Yeah.
I'm better off." So political involvement for many no longer means going to school board meetings or city council meetings. It means getting online and
Yeah.
commenting and
Right.
flaming people
Right.
and so on and weighing in about big issues. Um,
Mm.
Not actually, no. that's
Right.
that's really ephemeral and
Mhm.
and can be quite harmful in a lot of
Mhm.
ways. I mean, it can be good, I'm sure, in some ways, but I think getting in the room in person with other people and debating and coming to common solutions
Mm.
um, is still the way to have a functioning democratic society.
Yeah. 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 I agree with that. And I think I want to ask you what so we talked about all these different stages of liberalism kind of fluidly in this conversation. Can you just break down, I guess, more clearly your vision for the future? So is it pluralistic liberalism? Is that the right term
Yeah,
to use?
yeah.
Okay.
That's Yeah, that's a term I use, and it's not something completely new. It took me a while to think of that name,
Yeah.
and I'm not completely satisfied. I
Hmm.
mean, liberalism originally was supposed to be pluralistic, so it's kind of
Yeah.
redundant. But
Yeah.
but I think pluralism uh, has been pushed in the background for a lot of people.
Hmm.
Liberalism has become more about actually kind of conformity. There's certain words you have to use, or else you
Yeah.
don't belong here, and that kind of.
Yeah.
And it's hard to the list of words seems to change every day, so
Yeah.
it's very hard to kind of figure out. Right, so that's not very pluralistic, really. Um, Again, without romanticizing the past, there were I teach students at UVA who would not have been allowed at UVA not too long ago, or would have had a hard time.
Mm.
And I'm so glad they're there. I'm so glad that the universities and institutes of society are more inclusive than they used to be. So I want to be clear about that. I'm not nostalgic for the 1950s or the 1850s.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Maybe the 1750s. No, no.
Yeah.
Um, but
That's right.
so pluralistic liberalism. So in my scheme, all of these liberalisms, classical, welfare, and open, come about because smart people look around and say, not everybody in our society is really free the way they're supposed to be.
Mm.
And we're all about liberty. So what's going on here? And they typically will look and say, what's the chief threat to personal liberty in our time? Not 100 years ago, but right now.
Yeah.
So the welfare liberals in the early 20th century said that the real threat to personal liberty is what you could call unfettered capitalism.
Mm.
Again, whether they're right or wrong, I'm setting aside, but they really thought this was true. And they had a case that the Industrial Revolution had brought about this entirely new class of people, factory and mine workers,
Yeah.
who had lousy lives. They could not bargain collectively. They had no safeguards against unemployment, and
Mm.
they worked long hours, blah, blah, blah. So welfare liberalism was an attempt to correct for that and
Mhm.
say we're going to have to change law and policy so that we can ensure more liberty for more people. Open liberalism, same process. What's the chief threat to liberalism? So now I think we should do this again. Why do so many people not feel free? Why are they not living the lives they want to? Why do those lives seem completely unavailable to
Mm.
them? And I think it's because open liberalism it served a purpose. It had some successes some decades ago, but it is now the problem. This notion that of unfettered, complete openness, what a sociologist called liquid modernity, that
Okay.
the good life consists in never really committing, not only
Yeah.
not having to commit, but never actually committing, always being open to change, in not
Yeah.
just in
Yeah.
your career, where you live, who you're with, your
Mhm.
marriage, if you want marriage, who you are, your gender, when
Yeah.
you die, how you die, all these things are up for grabs. And
Open-mindedness is a cardinal
yeah,
virtue. Yeah.
yeah. And so people who, if you believe most people are by nature people who want and need to commit to other people, maybe to a place, to a community, both a geographic, a town or a city, a church or a synagogue or a mosque, then open liberalism makes that very hard, very expensive,
Mhm.
right? Because it's always pressing on us newness, novelty, change. Um, so paradoxically, open liberalism makes us less free. If we want to commit, it makes it harder. So pluralistic liberalism is a liberalism that actually values and doesn't penalize commitment
Mm.
of that sort. Now, how that plays out, I've been arguing with some
Mm.
colleagues about what this looks like in practice, and I'm not ready to go there. I think
Sure.
that's the work of a generation to figure out how we
Mhm.
would get there, what that would look like in practice.
Right.
But I think it might require really judicious moves back towards some of the older liberalisms.
Mm.
Maybe so. For example, one reason why it's very hard to commit to not just a job but a community is China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. with American approval. Both the Clinton and the Bush administrations wanted this to happen. In fact, I thought it was a good idea at the time, but it has resulted in a heavy deindustrialization in the American heartland. Lots of 2.5 million industrial jobs were lost from that alone. Right.
Wow.
So it might be time to, and a lot of people are rethinking this. Was this really good for democracy in the United States? You can apply this to Europe as well. There's been a lot of deindustrialization and moving around and so on. So it might involve at least revisiting some of those issues that I thought were settled. Right.
Yeah.
I'm learning as I go along, but I think that I want to keep my focus on the big picture, which is there's something defective in the liberalism we have. And I would, again, focus on the way it penalizes commitment across a number of realms of life. That actually damages institutions. If you can't, institutions can only thrive if people are committed to them over time. And they pass that commitment on to their friends and their children and so on. And it's just very hard to do that sort of thing right now in modern America.
It's interesting. I think about through this conversation, I love the movie that came out, was that last year? Oppenheimer. I don't know if you saw that. I love that movie. I think Christopher Nolan, aside from the graphic sex scenes, it's an amazing movie, but I think Christopher Nolan is one of the best filmmakers of our time. And there's that point in the movie where Oppenheimer's talking to Albert Einstein, and Einstein's kind of like he's just saying, like, they're just throwing you to the wolves. You gave everything to this country and now they don't even care about you. Why don't you turn your back on her? And Oppenheimer has this, he says, because I happen to love this country. Like, that was his answer. I happen to love this country. And there's something patriotic about that I had never, for myself. I mean, in my lifetime, that's never been the attitude. I happen to love this country. I happen to love this institution. That's why I'm not going to turn my back on it. Yeah. And I don't even know, part of me as I watched that was like, I don't even really know how to turn that concept into action in a lot of ways in my own life. Like, what does that even mean to fall in love with an institution or a country, or to fall in love with something bigger than yourself in this highly individualistic world? And that tension that you're talking about between this liberalism is maintaining and preserving those individualistic freedoms, but it's all we're within a country, within a state. We're within something bigger than ourselves. We have to exist in that tension. And how do you not go too far? How do you not swing the pendulum too far in either direction is a real.
Yeah. It's a really acute question, because we have run afoul of that in the past, right? Mm-hmm. I would say my parents' generation were very patriotic because they grew up in World War II. Yeah. And that led to a my country, right or wrong ethos, which meant we stayed in Vietnam too long. And especially American evangelicals, conflated America with the kingdom of God, right? Yeah. And it's all the same thing. And that's idolatry, and it's all wrong. Yeah. And, I'm glad we've moved beyond that, but maybe we have the pendulum has swung a bit too far where America, who cares? It's lousy. It's no good. And I don't feel it in my heart. I don't really care. Yeah. Why should I? I think we can think of it as analogous to the family. You can love your family without hating your non-family, the rest of the human race. Sure. There's just a special love and a special commitment and a special kind of sacrifice for your family. Yeah. And the same is with your community, your town, and your country. And so I say this, again, I'm in Canada now. I love it when I see signs of patriotism in Canada. And Canada's going through the same sorts of things as the United States, maybe in some ways more accelerated. Yeah. But I think love of country, as long as it doesn't degenerate into hatred or contempt for foreigners or this kind of superiority, which sometimes it does. Yeah. And we could argue about the word nationalism. What is it exactly? Yeah. I like the word patriotism. Yeah. Nationalism can shade into some things that I think are quite unhealthy and idolatrous. But yeah, patriotism, rightly understood, is a virtue. I think you look at Paul talking in Romans about his people, the Jewish people. They have special theological significance. That's part of what he's talking about. But it's also his people. Right. These are his folks, and he weeps for them.
Mm.
Um,
Mhm.
Jesus wept for Jerusalem.
Right.
Again, theologically significant in a way that,
Right.
Chicago is not. But
Yeah.
also, that's the
Yeah.
Jewish capital. And he's
Right.
he's he's a Jew, Jesus.
Right. Right.
So so
Right.
it's okay to feel this special love for where God has put you, I think.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and it's actually, I think, that sort of love that should produce a self-sacrificial lifestyle, and for the people immediately around you, right? It's I like that how you said that, because you don't often think about the command to love your neighbor as yourself in relationship to the fact that God put you exactly where you are today, so that you do that with these people, not
Yeah.
just some abstract concept of just loving people. But no, it's like
Yeah.
your family, your church, your community, the people that
Yeah.
you live next to.
They're the ones God has put in your way, and He's
Mhm.
put you in their way, and you go from there. And this gets back to this, you know, what does a good political life consist of? Well,
Yeah.
it can consist of social media and commenting, but if that's all you're doing, you're really living in an
Yeah.
abstract world, disembodied political world. It's not
Yeah.
real,
Right.
actually. We are embodied creatures. We are physically around other people, and those are the people we need to interact with more.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay, I want to ask one last question, because I think, and it's a bit of a practical question, as we've talked a lot about political philosophy and cultural trends, and how to interact with the political world that we live in. You are a professor in an institution that I don't know about University of Virginia specifically, but if it's anything like any of the other public institutions in the United States, the public universities, there's, like you said earlier, there's a lot of the counterculture is the culture, and the kind of counterculture of the 60s is the culture in the institution that you exist in. So as a Christian yourself, as you have to exist in these institutions, and you're coming across people probably all the time that disagree with your worldview and things like that. How do you do that? Because you're every institution is a political institution, and that you are interacting with other human beings. And so, what do you do as a Christian in these situations?
Yeah, well, uh, UVA is not only secular; it was deliberately founded by Thomas Jefferson to be the first
Yeah.
truly secular institution, early 19th century.
Wow.
So that said, it's very pluralistic, and in a good.
Yeah.
It's not perfect. I have complaints about it, but
Hmm.
um, I'm content there. It allows me to teach, what I want, and
Hmm.
there'll be no penalty if any colleagues at UVA find out that I'm doing this with you. No
Yeah.
penalty,
No problem.
right? That's John's thing. It's not my thing. If he wants to do that, that's fine.
Hmm.
Um, there's a heavy. It's so pluralistic that there's a heavy Christian presence. Lots of parachurch ministries,
Oh, interesting.
InterVarsity, Reformed
Mm,
University Fellowship, Chi Alpha,
mm,
Campus Crusade. They're all there,
mm.
and lots of them are thriving. There's a Christian Study Center like the one you're sitting in that's been
Yeah.
there since 1976,
Wow.
and the university welcomes it.
Hmm.
Um, and so it is, all universities have problems. There are currents there. There are people who work there or study there who would rather there not be much of a Christian presence, or
Mm.
maybe think it's getting out of hand. This is just part of what you accept when you're at a secular pluralistic institution, right?
Sure.
But at the same time, I'm very much in the game, and other Christians, people on the right and the left. I think UVA works very, very hard, and its current leadership. I know the leadership pretty well by now. I think sincerely want it to remain pluralistic and not become a conformist,
Mm.
left wing woke conformist institution,
Sure.
or a right wing one. They don't want. They want it because universities thrive best, and they're most themselves when all ideas get a hearing. And that's right out of Jefferson. Jefferson, there's a carving on the side of one of our buildings. I'm going to mangle the paraphrase, but it's
Sure.
here we are not afraid to let error be
Mm.
voiced as long as the truth remains to combat it. In other
Yeah.
words,
Right.
you can voice your ideas. It's not that all ideas are equally good. They're not. But what happens at a well-functioning college or university is you hear the ideas, you sift them, you talk about them, you don't name call, you don't exclude, but you do argue about them, and you have to be willing to change your mind, right? You might be wrong. The university is really where that has to happen. That's the place in society where that is most appropriate, right? So UVA, for all its issues, and every university has them, is a place where that still happens. And I find, as a Christian academic, it's been a very good place for me to work and conduct research and teach and do all the things you do.
Yeah, it's a cool thing. I mean, what you're saying, and what Jefferson's quote was, it's a cool thing about the truth is just that no matter where you are, if you speak it, in and of itself, it can have the power to change somebody's mind, or it can have the power to change your mind. And so while there is a hard pushback against certain ideologies from conservative Christians, that I think it's warranted in certain ways. I think some of these ideologies can be incredibly destructive and potentially ruin people's lives. There's also a temptation to annihilate to get rid of all other ideas, even. And I run into that. That's like my temperament. I'm like a disagreeable person who wants to be right. I want to basically say my ideas are right all the time, and that's pride and arrogance in a lot of situations. And you have to leave the door somewhat open to some degree. And we're going to all disagree on what degree do you leave that open, and in relationship to what society that you're in and what area that you exist in. But it has to be open to some degree, and you have to be willing to be wrong about things, and there has to be dialogue. And I think you're right. And I think Christ is right. That at the end of the day, the truth isn't going to die. The truth is going to continue to live on regardless of how many people are telling it. Somebody will pick it up at some point, and they'll proclaim it, and people will believe it.
Yeah. Let me just say one last thing. This sounds like we've gone all individualistic and whatever happened to the institutions. I think it's important for faculty and students and staff at colleges and universities and afterward to keep in mind that we do best when we're in communities. Right. So for Christians, it's be in the church and be molded by the church, which is God's instrument, we believe. But don't withdraw from talking to, even arguing with people outside the church or in a different church. Right. So this is not just isolated individuals seeking the truth without it. Being embedded in community really, I think, is essential to this picture. But that doesn't mean being simply closed off within your community and warding off and staying away from outsiders. That also is a destructive path.
Right. Yeah. One thing that I say on this podcast a lot, I think orthodoxy produces orthopraxy. And in the church, orthodoxy, I think the church, the institution of the church, the local church, is meant to close that door to openness a lot more. There's, orthodox belief, Christian belief, can't be open to destructive heresies. And the New Testament talks about this all over the place. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can never have conversations about how to interact with, how are we going to do evangelism, things like that. There's different conversations that can be had there, but you can't compromise the orthodox belief system that your church is functioning and operating out of. But orthodoxy produces orthopraxy out in the real world. And I know Christians who just want to say, after COVID, I saw this all the time. Okay, those people who get the vaccines are crazy. It's the mark of the beast. I mean, it was craziness around the vaccine. It was like the mark of the beast. And people that I knew isolated, and to this day, they don't talk to anybody that they disagree with. And it's unbelievable to me. It's like, that's a miserable life. I disagree with people all the time, and it's what makes things interesting and fun. It's like I was just having a conversation yesterday with a coworker of mine who he's not a Christian. He's a gay man. And he asked me, as a Christian, do you think that my lifestyle is wrong? I had to tell him, yes, I do. I think that homosexuality is a sin. But we had an hour and a half conversation about it. It was totally civil. It was all good. And I was totally open with him about what I thought, and he was totally civil with me, and I care about him. And those are some of the best conversations I've ever had in my life, because you can see, I guess from my perspective as a Christian, the way in which God works through, I guess, works through just telling the truth to people. People are like, oh, I've never even heard that before, or whatever. And you're like, yeah, well, like, I've never heard what you said. And so it's the beauty of the dialogue. But I don't mean to drag this out forever, but I just think that's important.
No, that's encouraging. That moment, that hour and a half required, charity from both of you and him. And it's encouraging when those moments happen. That's great.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. Any parting words for people real quick before we sign off here, just to maybe encourage some younger people in their pursuit of living out their faith in the political world?
Yeah, let's see. It's funny. I'm a scholar of international relations. We've talked a bit about that.
I know
you brought us back to that, but we've talked about all kinds of things, and that's been great. Mm-hmm. And some really important things, I think, for younger folks. I have 3 adult children, so I've had these conversations in this part of my life now. But I do think, I guess I would focus on thinking about community and institution, and don't, and I mean in person in part. So we need community. I do get concerned. I'm not a technological determinist, but I think one problem has been, these things and the way they can, they do produce a kind of community. But it's a defective kind of substitute for the real thing. And again, it's not just about the young people. This is not the old guy saying, in my day, all of society right up the age chain is affected by this. So I think, throw dinner parties. If you got roommates, say, hey, why don't we once a week or once a month have people over and let's have some conversation about, let's have a couple of topics. My wife and I have done this for a few years with, 8 to 12 people, 20 and 30 somethings, once a week over for soup. And we have, it's pretty casual. It's very nice food. But we have a topic or two. It's a community builder, and we don't allow phones at the table. So, but think of concrete things like that you might be able to do. It's not hard. It's not expensive necessarily. And you might find this is an ingredient of a better life. And I'm making friends, and I'm looking forward to this every week. So think of concrete ways to build community, I would say, within your church, outside your church, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm going to, and maybe this isn't exactly what you're envisioning, but I'm going to a cigar lounge tomorrow with some friends. And it's one thing that I know some people are going to be like, well, you shouldn't smoke cigars. I don't know. I maybe do a podcast on that a different day, but I do smoke cigars every once in a while. And I obviously think that you can do it in abundance, but there's something about sitting down with a cigar, or just in a group of guys, for me, just talking about everything for like 3 or 4 hours. It's amazing. I love all that. And that's something that's been lost to my generation, because we do it in group chats on our phones, but it's not the same. It's just not the same. Yeah. So cigars if you have to. I've done that a few times. I have trouble getting the taste out of my mouth the next day, but if that's your thing, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, John Owen, thank you so much for doing this podcast. This has been obviously a wide ranging conversation, but I think it's gonna be really helpful for people. It's really helpful for me reading your book, and I'm going to finish your book, is been helpful for me in understanding the international landscape. I feel like as I've gone through the last year on this journey of trying to figure out what the heck do I think politically, and how do I attach that, and how do I actually proceed out of my theological conviction towards a political conviction. People like you have been incredibly helpful in informing that in certain particular ways. I did an interview with Patrick Deneen a year ago, which was really helpful. And then I talked to a reporter just the other week, and all of these people who share convictions and totally differ in their convictions it's been really helpful. I think people are going to be really, really encouraged by what you have to say.
No, well, I'm encouraged by what you've said, and by our conversation the last couple of hours. Thanks very much, Andy.
Yeah, thank you. And if you're listening to this podcast, you like it, make sure you like, subscribe, share this with your friends, leave us a 5-star rating, and we will see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.